Well, good morning, and thank you for being part of this month's Public Affairs webinar. My name is Mark Loftus. I am interim president of the Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce and also a member of the board. We have a great program for you today as we hear from people who are elected officials who are in the Minnesota Legislature from both the House and the Senate and from both caucuses. And I spent time in the legislature myself, working from a state agency perspective, and I know personally how hard our elected officials work on our behalf, how time consuming and challenging and difficult that work is. So we're grateful to all of you for the important work that you do. I would also say that on behalf of the chamber, we have also been working very hard during the past challenging year. It's been hard for us to stay in touch with our members, but we've done our best with virtual communications, with online programs like this, with information that we can provide to you to keep you updated on a variety of public affairs and issues. So we hope that the work that we've done has been of value to your membership. If you're a new member, we're grateful to that. If you're a longtime member, we thank you for your continuing support during these challenging times. And on a personal note, I would be very happy to see all of you in person once again. And the news from yesterday that I'm sure we'll talk about today suggests that we'll be able to be open and for business in public with our members very, very soon. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the chair of our Public Affairs Committee and a fellow member of the Dakota Chamber Board with me, Amanda Doerr, who's with Charter Communications. Amanda?
Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks again for stepping in your role. You're doing a great job as an interim leader, and thanks for all the support you provide the Chamber. First off, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors for today's programs, which are Charter Communications, Flint Hills Resources, and Velocity Public Affairs. These companies' commitment and involvement are evidence of the value they place on being engaged in the Dakota County Regional Chamber. Velocity Public Affairs is our program sponsor today. Velocity Public Affairs is a full-service public affairs company that combines experienced leadership with market-leading proprietary technology to help clients strategically address and manage public affairs challenges and opportunities. And we have two series sponsors for the Public Affairs series, which are Flint Hills Resources and Charter Communications. Flint Hills Resources is an industry leader in refining chemicals, biofuels, and ingredients. Flint Hills Resources directly and indirectly supports more than 4,000 Minnesota jobs and has invested nearly $1.7 billion on upgrades and improvements to its Minnesota facilities since 2010. With almost 1,000 full-time employees, the Flint Hills Resources Pine Bend Refinery is one of the largest employers in Dakota County. And Charter Communications is a leading broadband connectivity company and cable operator serving more than 31 million customers in 41 states through its Spectrum brand. Over an advanced communications network, the company offers a full range of state-of-the-art residential and business services, including Spectrum Internet, TV, mobile, and voice. In Minnesota, Charter serves 356,000 customers in 168 communities. Now, we'll go on to today's program. As we're less than 2 weeks before the constitutional adjournment date of the 2021 legislative session, many critical issues such as tax conformity, transportation funding, workplace mandates, and other business issues, and the large elephant in the room, the state budget, are still on the table with no final agreement. The outcomes will be critical to the success of the business community of Dakota County and the state of Minnesota. So today we have with us leadership from all 4 legislative caucuses to give us their thoughts on where things are at with session negotiations. And I'm honored to introduce our speakers today. Representative Kali Herr represents District 64A, which includes the Summit Hill, Midway, and St. Anthony Park neighborhoods of St. Paul. She was first elected to the Minnesota House in 2018. She serves as the Majority Whip for the House DFL caucus. Representative Anu Brindley represents District 32B, which covers much of Chisago County, including the city of North Branch, where I grew up. She was first elected in a 2017 special election. Representative New Brindley serves as the Deputy Minority Leader for the House Republican Caucus. Senator Zach Duckworth represents District 58 in Dakota County, including the cities of Lakeville and Farmington. He was first elected to the Senate in 2020. Senator Duckworth serves as an Assistant Majority Leader for the Senate Republican Caucus. And Senator Melissa Franzen represents District 49, which includes the city of Edina and parts of Bloomington and Minnetonka. She was first elected to the Senate in 2012. She serves as an Assistant Minority Leader for the Senate DFL Caucus. So like Mark mentioned before, thank you all for taking time out of this very busy time in the legislative session to be here with us today. This is always one of the most popular events that the chamber does every year because everyone is very anxious to get the inside scoop about what's going on with legislative negotiations. So I think I will start it out with kind of the big overarching question, which is obviously the House and the Senate have very different budgets that they have proposed. And at least as of prior to this starting, I wasn't aware that there was any agreement in terms of universal budget targets. And so I'm just curious, you know, what's it going to look like to reconcile the very different budgets that have been proposed by the House and the Senate? And perhaps first, I will start with Representative Herr to address the House budget, and then maybe I'll go to Senator Duckworth after that.
Thank you, Amanda. And I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation for being here today. So, you know, I have the privilege of serving on the tax committee, and I actually was appointed to the conference committee, which means that I don't know how many people here are familiar with the legislative process, but there is a group of us that is appointed, and then we work together, a group from the Senate and a group from the House, and then we look at our, you know, what's been proposed, and we figure out how we're going to come to a compromise and moving a bill forward that we can all get behind. And so I would have to say that I sort of felt the way you did, Amanda, even in this process, feeling like, wow, that we're putting forward such different, you know, omnibus bills from each of our, you know, committees, and the tax bill looks very different. But as I've sat through this conference committee, you know, what we've done in the last few days in the conference committee is look at where all the places we do agree and all the places in which we can move forward. And we actually voted a couple of provisions forward already. And I am really hopeful, because even though some of the you know, provisions are very different, I think that at the heart of what we are all trying to do is really put Minnesotans first. And it just is a matter of the approach that we're taking to move forward with how do we do that. And so even though there may be quite a few differences, there are a lot of similarities as well. And that I am always an eternal optimist. And so I feel like if there's a will, that there's always going to be a way where we will come to a compromise, and we will be able to put together and forward a budget that we can all agree on that really does put Minnesotans first.
I mean, are the budgets really that different between the House and the Senate? I'm just kidding, of course. And so I agree with much of what Representative Herr said, especially with the provisions in each respective conference committees that seem to be in alignment. Getting those passed and through is kind of important. I think that's what most of this week has been spent on in terms of conference committees, is looking at how are they different, where are the ways in which they're similar, and let's just get that passed so that we can begin having the conversation surrounding negotiations. So I think, unfortunately, you will probably find my insight kind of lacking. Not only am I a new guy, I'm a new guy during a pretty unprecedented time. And so I've never been through this before, and none of us have been through it with these circumstances going on. So I think if anybody tells you they know exactly what's going to happen, or they have an 80 or 90% feeling of what we're going to see come toward the end of session, they're probably not being honest with themselves. But here's what I do know. You know, a unique circumstance that we're dealing with right now, both the House and the Senate, is that the federal government is sending a lot of money to the state of Minnesota. And how that comes into play regarding the budget that we set is interesting. Obviously, people have different thoughts about those federal dollars all across the board. But the reality of the situation is we have to be mindful of those federal dollars, how and where they can be utilized, and then what second and third order effects does that mean for Minnesota and the budget that we have to pass. And so hopefully we can find some common ground in relation to the budget in time for the close of session, and also have a good plan for a lot of those federal dollars. So I do know that Senator Gazelka, the governor, Speaker Hortman have been in conversation. They've begun to have some of those initial back and forth communications that need to take place that are necessary to move us all forward. I think that happened as early as Monday or Tuesday this week, and I know they continue to be in dialogue. So we'll see what kind of back and forth occurs there as well, in addition to what's occurring in our conference committees. And hopefully toward mid next week, we'll have a little bit more confidence, a little bit more insight as to where we truly stand. And again, thank you all for the invite to be here this morning. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. And maybe I'll pivot a little bit and open it up first to Senator Franzen and Representative New Brindley. But, you know, I think your caucuses might, you know, feel, you know, have a little different perspective on the end game here. But, you know, what do you think is the likelihood of getting a budget completed by the end of the regular session? Or, you know, do you see this going into overtime?
I can start with that. So thank you, first of all, for having me on this panel. This is, I always find time for these forums, and especially with COVID, because you are not at the legislature, unfortunately. It's been a very different legislative session with not having all the advocates' ability to come to our office and have those one-on-ones. So we're doing most of that through phone calls, texts, and virtually like we are today. So this is my 9th session. So I'm not a newbie anymore, and I've been through this process already. This is my fifth time. So it's certainly, we don't know what's going to happen until the very end. I've been on the Senate floor upwards of 5 minutes to midnight, and we're still trying to pass a bonding bill in the last few seconds. And you've all have seen those stories. That's not the way we should be doing business in the state, but that's the way the process ultimately works when there's agreements made at the very last minute. But there's certainly an ability that, you know, it could go to overtime. I don't expect it to go too far into overtime, but here's what's happening. And I sit on the finance committee, and we still haven't received the targets. They're supposed to be announced today by both parties. So that is the base of what the work will look like next week, as Senator Duckworth mentioned. Without those targets, the work really, you're just looking at similar language and approving it and waiting for those big budget items to come into debate next week when you have those targets. So that is the fundamental piece that has to be in play, and it's due today. I had a quick conversation with Senator Gazelka yesterday. He was saying how positive he felt with the conversations with Speaker Hortman. So that's always a good thing. And we do talk to each other. Like I just walked in the chamber and talked to Senator Gazelka, and he seemed optimistic of getting at least having that line of communication. I've served on taxes, and I've also served on Health and Human Services, which is the biggest bulk of money coming from the federal government, not to exclude education. That's mostly state money. But we are having those federal transfers coming from the ARP, American Rescue Plan, and that's to the tune of $2 billion. And to just put things in perspective, Minnesota's budget is $50 billion-ish, and then the surplus announced was 1.6. That surplus essentially it doesn't count inflation, so it really goes down to 260 million, an estimate of something like that. Just yesterday on the floor, we spent 68 million on burning trees with emerald ash borer from your utilities. So it's not huge numbers when you come to think about the bills that we pass in the legislature, and at the end of the day, how we're going to move forward to get a $50 billion budget agreed upon. So it's a lot of work, but I think the federal money coming is one time, and we all know that it's going to be a year or two for us to spend it. So it's not reliable, it's not sustainable, as much as a surplus isn't either, if you only have really $260 million left of your surplus. And we also know that COVID has hit our communities very, very hard everywhere in our state. So there are needs that need to be met, and they shouldn't be one time. We have to use this as an opportunity to not only fill those gaps that were already there, but invest to make sure that we come out of this pandemic stronger. So I think the funding on education is critical. The funding on Health and Human Services is critical, and obviously infrastructure, because we keep pushing that can, kicking that can down the road. And there is some federal funding coming for that as well. The question is, how do we spend it and when do we get the guidance to spend it? It might be after the session. So that's where I think the overtime might kick in, practically speaking, but I can't foresee the future, but I can say that the guidance is not expected until the summer. So if we're not gonna be able to spend, for instance, $254 million just on childcare without our input, that might be something that needs to be agreed upon later. But again, these are the conversations that the leadership is having. As a leader in my caucus in the DFL in the Senate, we have different priorities in the Senate majority in the Senate, and part of that is law enforcement reform. And I speak to it as a suburban mom in a very quote unquote safe district, right? But I also have a business in Minneapolis, and I want to make sure that not just Minneapolis, but also Little Falls, where my husband's from, everyone is safe in Minnesota. And there, my father-in-law and my father were both law enforcement officers, and this is an opportunity that we can't dismiss of what's happening in Minnesota, what businesses need to succeed. I want to go back to my business in Minneapolis and feel safe and have my employees, my customers visit me. So this is about the entire community, the perception that Minnesota has, and the spotlight that we have with the verdict of Derek Chauvin, with the killing of Daunte Wright. And we can't ignore what's happening and how we're looked upon as to lead. So I think that has to be, that is on the table, and that needs to be come to an agreement on a bipartisan level.
Wow, Representative sorry, I keep calling you Representative. I'm so sorry, Senator Franson. You hit on so many of my upcoming questions with that. No, that's all right. But Representative New Brindley, if you want to, I was going to go into federal funding after this question about the likelihood of getting done on time. So if you have any thoughts that you also want to share about the federal funding and the role that plays in the budget, if you want to touch on that too in your comments, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. And it's always fun to see you, Amanda. I represent Amanda's hometown, so it's always fun to see her. I'm hopeful. There's no reason to not get out of here on time this year. I know, I find that chamber members are generally a little more plugged in than the general population. So I'm sure that you all have watched this kind of thing in the past. But the reality is, we've still got just a little over a week left. And in legislative time, that's eons. That's a lot of time actually to get things done at this point. As the others indicated, we've gone through the same and similars, that's what we call it, as we go through the different versions of the bills. And now we wait for targets. Ultimately, when the last time we did this under a split, well, not the last time, 2 years ago was the last time, but previously, when we did this under a split legislature, Representative Dowd and Senator Bach, I think they came up with targets on Friday, and we passed the budget on time. So I actually am quite hopeful on that. There are some sticking points. I think the reality is when we are looking at, essentially a $4 billion budget surplus between what we've got in the state and what's coming from the feds, it is raining money on the state of Minnesota right now. So and in private conversations, I think the Democrats ultimately understand that tax increases are going to be a pretty heavy lift for this session. And when it comes to the federal dollars, it's really critical that the legislature appropriate that money. It really is critical. Ultimately, Governor Walz came out yesterday with sort of his final dial turns and sort of this final plan for COVID. And the reality is, if we're looking at an end to mask mandates, he has told us that the state fair will look essentially normal. We're not under an emergency anymore. It is no longer an emergency. If there's no need for masks, if there is no need, if we get to have a normal state fair, I think it's really tough to argue that the emergency now is what it was even 3 months ago or 6 months ago. Almost 60% of Minnesotans are vaccinated at this point. Cases continue to drop. We're in a really good position. But I think it's really critical to note then, if the governor holds on to his emergency powers, it's for two reasons. It is so that he can appropriate money himself, those federal dollars, and it is so that he can write laws, so that he is directing the state. both of those duties are constitutionally given to the legislature. The legislature is the power of the purse, and the legislature is the sole authority to write laws. And again, if the governor continues with his emergency powers at this point, it's so that he can control the purse, and it's so that he can control public policy, which is really the job of the legislature. So I think it is really critical with those federal dollars that the legislature does have control and appropriate those funds. But I think we can easily do that and get out of here on time, which is the good news.
Thank you. And wow, you teed up another one too. You guys are just on fire this morning. But maybe I'll shift a little bit. Representative New Brindley alluded to the governor's announcement yesterday with the dial turns and kind of the path moving forward in terms of reopening and emergency powers and executive orders. And maybe for Senator Duckworth and Representative Herr, you know, what and again, Representative New Brindley talked about it, like what role do you think, you know, these emergency powers and executive orders and the federal funding all together kind of play into the end of session negotiations in terms of positions the caucuses may take in getting to the final deal?
I'm happy to jump on that one if that's okay. I guess I would put it to you this way. There's a huge looming shadow that overarches this entire budget negotiation process, and that is the question of the governor's emergency powers. And that, I mean, getting to the end of session and negotiating a budget is interesting and complex enough, let alone with that both political and just operational component being in the mix. And so you've got a lot of Minnesotans out there that are frustrated. They're somewhat confused, and they desire to see more certainty in their lives again. And I'm not going to make this panel discussion about the governor and his emergency powers exclusively. I think, you know, folks span the spectrum on that. But what I will say is it definitely is a part of the conversation running in parallel to our budget discussion and negotiation. There's a lot of people out there that don't want us to pass a budget unless those emergency powers are gone. Now, I'm not sure if that's the right thing or has the best interest for Minnesota at heart, but I can definitely understand where folks are coming from, because to Representative New Brindley's point, you know, given our state's constitution, it's the legislature's duty to help construct that budget and decide how the state's going to spend its money. And right now, our ability to do so, our ability to partake in that process is significantly limited. And there are only so many things we can do as a legislature, given our circumstance, to try to put pressure or force the question regarding emergency powers. So not to get too fired up about that, but we would all be kidding ourselves if we didn't acknowledge that that is a big factor that's coming into play regarding negotiations right now.
Well, and Amanda, I do just want to add a little bit that, you know, I think that it has been difficult to legislate, you know, in the way that we've been operating, what our businesses and our Minnesotans have sacrificed in order for us to keep our state safe. You know, our legislators have been doing the same, and that to legislate remotely is really challenging. But, you know, I would push back just a little bit, because you know, though it is the legislature's responsibility to make the laws, and we do hold the purse strings, I think that we also have to remember that we do have to come in agreement, and that the governor doesn't get to just decide that he's going to make laws now and decide what he wants to do with the budget. And the truth is that if we as a group cannot come to a compromise, we decide to give up the power to do that. We showed that you know, there were many times we agreed in which we passed police reform, we passed a number of things last year, but we also did not come together in understanding what we wanted to do with the CARES Act funding, which ended up falling onto the governor's responsibility. That's not because the governor decided he would take that from us, but it's because we as a legislature could not come to agreement between the different parties. And so for us to understand that we play a responsibility, if we want to direct the way those funds goes, how they get used, we all need to work together too. And so I just want to make sure that we understand that it is not just you know, an individual deciding what they're going to do with funds. I would also just want to say that I think that it is a good time for us to loosen up on the restrictions for our state. But I also want to caution us in which that, you know, we may talk about how things are getting better, people are getting vaccinated. but we are seeing hospitals again back up to full capacity and unable to take in patients. We are seeing surges within our hospitals, emergency rooms again. And so for us to know that as Minnesotans, we should absolutely be gradually opening up because our businesses have been hurting. People do need to be out because of mental health issues and being with each other. But we also have to remember to do it in a way that is cautious, because what would be the we opened our businesses back up and we see a surge because people aren't being cautious because they think that the pandemic is behind us, and then we have to again do another shutdown or close businesses so that we can contain the infections again. And so I think that there's a really delicate balance here about how we move forward in supporting our businesses, supporting our residents, and ensuring that we all do so in a safe manner, and that we all play a role in being responsible about the budget and what we're going to do, and we're going to move forward. And to be honest, yes, we do have, and I'm going to again reiterate what Senator Franzen said, was that yes, there is a huge surplus, and it may look like we're raining money, but this is a lot of it is a one-time funding. And if we want Minnesotans to do well coming out of this recovery, we need to dedicate revenue sources that continue to support education, continue to support small businesses, continue to support working families, continue to support the growth within our counties and our cities, because though the state allocates funds, there are a lot that our counties and our cities are responsible for in taking care of residents. How do we continue to provide the ongoing revenues that allow our state to thrive? And so I just want to make sure that this is not just about this budget, but looking into the future beyond the one-time funding and what that's going to mean for our residents to stay healthy and grow in Minnesota here.
Can I just add to Amanda that just for perspective, there are federal transfers every year that happen that the legislature is not involved, that we don't need to appropriate. Medicaid is a good example. We don't go to the legislature every time Medicaid money flows into a state. There's a process where federal money goes directly to schools, et cetera. So there's many examples of that. But one thing that the emergency powers do grant us right now during COVID has been SNAP funding. So Minnesota has received $31 million a month for SNAP, for food assistance, and that money would not be coming in if it's not but for the emergency powers. And that assistance has gone to 175,000 Minnesotans households. So if we stop doing that, we lose that money. And in addition, they've updated the law in this last Recovery Act, where they've now added 11 million to that money per month. So those are real dollars to help families who have lost jobs, families who have been quarantined, families who are really struggling with the pandemic. So that's something that's not lost on us. So I think the public should know that it's not just, we just want emergency powers to have a mask mandate. There's federal money attached to that. In addition, in the beginning of the pandemic, it was critical to also get testing sites and now vaccination sites in place that the emergency powers also allow us to use, for instance, the National Guard. So there are attachments of why they're still necessary. I agree. I wholeheartedly believe I got elected to represent my constituents and to pass laws and appropriate money, not the governor. That is my job. He signs our laws, or she someday. So the other piece that's critical is the eviction moratorium, that if we just eliminate the emergency powers, people can go homeless. And why do I say that? It's literally, we all know this. We had a crisis of housing before the pandemic. Now it's just got exacerbated. And there's people who owe money to landlords. And we have to figure out how we're going to do that. Are we going to use some loans, grants? There's some federal money coming for that too. But we have to have a plan in place for that eviction moratorium to go away. And at the federal level and at the state level, there's two. The other piece is DHS rules. There's been a lot of health and human services rules that have been exempted, or for people to get services at home, because now we're virtual, and those rules are in place. Some of them have been codified by our legislature this year, and we just have to make sure that we are ready to switch the light switch off or on, or in this case off. And then the mask mandate, I think, is now, as you saw from the announcement yesterday, it's scheduled to go away July 1st. That's just really close by. And part of it is the vaccination rates have been moving up. And I think that is critical, that we continue to see those rates go up, that we have herd immunity sooner enough, that our kids can go back to school safely. So I think the mask mandate is probably, it was very politicized in the beginning. Now I think you're going to still see them in public places because people choose to use them, right? And some people will not be vaccinated. So that's another protection. So I think that's something that should be depoliticized and moved on, but it's scheduled to be turned off by July 1st, hopefully.
Amanda, I need to jump in here as well. I just would say really quickly, it is true that we get federal dollars all the time that the legislature does not appropriate. It comes to the state and it's automatically goes to certain programs. But it's pretty unprecedented to have $2 billion of discretionary funding coming into the state. There is some money that's coming in from the feds that is allocated directly, particularly to our schools, as Senator Franson said, to human services. But there is it's unprecedented to have billions of dollars of discretionary funds coming in from the federal government. So it's really sort of an unfair comparison on that front. The reality is this is money that is coming into the state that should be appropriated by the legislature and go through that transparent process.
Amanda, can I take one more minute just to follow up on some of so Senator Franson made some good points, and there's one thing in particular that I want to make sure folks have some awareness of, and that is some of the federal funding that we're getting on a regular basis sent to the state of Minnesota as it relates to the SNAP funds. And I want to bring it up and clarify a little bit, just because I've heard that reference several times, not just by her, but by other people, to include the governor. And I think there's an important distinction to make. There's a big distinction between the governor declaring a state of emergency for the state of Minnesota, which would allow us to receive that funding, and having emergency powers or using them in the manner in which he has or continues to use them. The state can have a declared state of emergency, but not have several executive orders, or can have them in much more limited scope, to Senator Franson's point, focused on vaccine distribution centers, utilizing members of the National Guard to help at long-term care facilities, et cetera. The emergency powers and how we think of them, or how they've been used over the last year and a half, is a little bit different from the state simply having a state of emergency that's declared that would still allow for those federal dollars. And that's why I'm hopeful and glad to hear us having this conversation about, rolling those back and what that looks like would take, because that's the direction we need to move to. And I think it's important we don't necessarily confuse folks about what we have to have in order to still receive those dollars, because we don't have to have a lot of those executive orders in place to still receive that federal funding. It's tied to that state of emergency. And Senator Franson's exactly right about the eviction moratorium. Having a plan in place is important. I'm very proud to have worked with the bipartisan working group, Senator Draheim, Senator Dietzig, Senator Port, and myself, to come up. We had a task force specifically to talk about an eviction moratorium off-ramp, and we passed that bill in the Senate with bipartisan support. So I'm grateful to Senator Franson and all members of the House and the Senate for looking forward and how we begin to take our state back in the direction of normalcy as things continue to improve.
Great, thank you. That was a great discussion there. I'm going to shift it a little bit to an item that's of pretty significant importance to a lot of chamber members and businesses throughout the state, and that is the tax conformity for the PPP loans. And I know the different caucuses have taken different approaches to that, and just kind of wanted to hear from each of you what you think the likelihood is of that passing this legislative session. And maybe I'll start with you, Representative Herr.
Sure. So, and this is a topic that has been on top of mind for many of us for a while, especially those of us in the tax committee. I would say that both the House and the Senate passed some form of PPP loan forgiveness. So it is likely, I believe that it is likely that there would be an end of session agreement. Our versions are a little bit different. In the House, our budget excludes PPP loans up to $350,000, which is 94% of all loans received. Full tax exemption, and we know that there were a number of larger companies that sort of gamed the system to receive huge loans. And our objective was that to really support small businesses and those who would have a difficult time recovering from this pandemic. And so that's why we had a cap at $350,000. And so I'm very hopeful that there will be a provision. We included in the House side provision for unemployment insurance, because we feel that as much as we need to give the employer, relief and conform in that way, that we also needed to ensure that individuals who received unemployment insurance are not unduly penalized for having received funds to help them to be able to pay rent and buy food and, keep their families, keeping their families safe. And so our provision includes unemployment insurance for those who've lost their job during the pandemic. And so I am very hopeful because there were provisions in both the House and the Senate, and I'll let my colleagues add on to that.
I think we'll reach an agreement there. I guess that's all I'm going to say. At least I'm hopeful we will.
All right.
So I have a PPP loan for my small business. So I'm not conflicted because they're not drafting this legislation for me, but I understand exactly how they're used, what the benefits are, and how much burden it is to actually get the tax bill of those PPP loans after the fact. So I just I'm working on my taxes right now, and my accountant just emailed back saying, well, we're going to park that because that might happen at the end of May. I'm like, yep, that's us. We have to do that. And I think there is a path. There's certainly an argument to be made that no business was expecting to get a state tax bill after getting a loan in the middle of a pandemic and of a national emergency. So I'm confident that we'll get somewhere with that. I think the question is, do we add employees, which is the unemployment insurance? And I think that should be part of the whole package. That's at least what we want to push for on the DFL side, and make sure that we not just take care of businesses, but we also take care of the tax bill that the employees are going to be getting for those unemployment insurance benefits that they received.
So I am more than hopeful on this. Honestly, I look at this as an issue that is 100% top priority. If this doesn't get done, this is the kind of issue that you hold out. This is a hill to die on. It is absurd to think that the state of Minnesota is going to profit off of relief aid that was given to businesses. And let's remember, it was not given to businesses to improve their structures, to grow their business. This was to help them survive a pandemic. This was to help them maintain employees who then did not have to go on unemployment insurance. This is not some bonus. Honestly, this is a hill to die on. So I am more than hopeful. I cannot imagine a budget passing without this. I think the real tragedy is that it's going to be done after taxes are due. This should have been done months ago, frankly, at the beginning of session. And I understand House Democrats wanted to hold out to use this for negotiations at the end of session here. But I think that's really unfortunate. Minnesota businesses are in the process of filing their taxes, and they don't have complete information to do so. And our position actually from the beginning has also been that we should include the $10,205 relief for those who were unemployed this year. We actually completely agree with that position. And this is a good use of those federal dollars. So we have plenty of money to do this. This is one-time tax relief, and it is inexcusable to not do it.
Amanda, can I just add really quick, though, that I think it is important for us to remember, and I think that, until I came into legislature, there were a lot of things that, were nuanced that I didn't understand either. And I just want to be really clear that the PPP conformity, that without the conformity, if businesses use the funds the way they were instructed to use, so, whether it's paying employee wages or paying their rent, that was already 100% deductible, that you did not need conformity in order for a business to not have to pay taxes on the PPP loans. So I just want to be really clear that this is not just an issue of people playing politics with conformity, that there was already provisions in place that ensured that if you took out a loan, you took out $100,000 and you used that all to pay for your rent and your employees, that was already 100% deductible. So I just want to be really clear that this isn't about, making Minnesotans pay taxes on money that, was given to them in an unfair way. There were already things set up so that they could do that. And I also want to be really clear that this isn't just about, looking at those who receive PPP funds, because our budget in the House includes $70 million for counties to assist businesses that need help. And this includes small businesses that did not receive PPP loans. And so I think that when we talk about this issue, we can't look at it from just saying, well, this is the main issue that we should be looking at is PPP. The truth is there were a lot of businesses that did not get funding because there wasn't enough money for everyone. And so again, when we look at long-term sustainability of our businesses and people, we have to look at not just what has already been given and how do we look at ensuring that those individuals and those funds are treated fairly, but we also have to look at who has also still been most disproportionately harmed by what has happened with COVID and the pandemic and the shutdown. And how do we ensure that those businesses get the support that they need? And how do we ensure that our states and our counties and our cities get the resources that they need? And again, that requires us to step up to the plate and look just not at the issues through a lens of just one issue, but the really comprehensively, holistically on everyone that has been impacted.
If there was ever a segue for a conversation regarding tax cuts, Amanda, that's it. Let's go.
Right. Well, I was going to ask, what's the, I know there's some proposals for tax increases. There's some proposals for tax cuts out there. And just kind of, if you had crystal ball, what would that, look like at the end of the session? So you all are just teeing everything up beautifully today.
I think Senator Duckworth wants to start on that one.
Well, no, I jumped in. So Senator Franzen, if you wanted to finish your thought before we switch topics.
I was just going to say, serving on the tax committee, again, it's very nuanced. Minnesota doesn't automatically conform to any federal changes. So that's why we have to proactively conform. And that's what's, this is normally conformity is boring and no one really cares except I don't know what's going on here, but nobody cares except your accountant.
Oh, you're muted again, Senator Franzen.
I'm not touching it, so I don't know what's going on. Maybe we should just move on to tax cuts.
Fair enough. And I think it's important. We talk about PPP all the time, and sometimes we forget that it stands for Payroll Protection Program, right? That's what it's there for, and that's helping everybody, to include the business and its employees. So. Taxes. So I'm a small business owner. I know several of us are. Senator Franzen is as well. And I guess I have a difficult time coming into budget conversations. And Representative New Brindley has mentioned it before, where we've got close to $4 or $5 billion one-time money coming from the federal government. We've got a surplus of 1.6. Yep, I understand there's some inflation to factor in there, et cetera. And then we're coming out of a period of time in which many people have struggled. Whether they're an employee, whether they are a business owner, et cetera. So for me, when I just take a step back and I try to apply some common sense to where we are, the funding that the state has available to it, and how we can best set people up for success moving forward, to me, that means no tax increases as we end session. I think we've all been pretty firm on that from a GOP standpoint, both in the House and the Senate. And here's the deal. I'm up for those debates. They're great conversations. Senator Franzen made some great points on the Senate floor when we debated the tax bill. I'm sure it was a great discussion in the House as well. But I think even all sides appear to be kind of understanding, or at least coming to the conclusion that a tax increase probably isn't the right time as we near into session and begin to continue to have our conversations and try to find some common ground and where we're going to end up.
I think you might be referring to Senator Dietzich, because I don't think I spoke on that bill, not this year, but I might speak to it on the Senate floor when it comes back. But serving
just
on
take the compliment over there.
I will. But I do see it from different perspective as a business owner, as a district that is disproportionately taxed, because I have a lot of business owners in higher income brackets. So I want to represent my district, and knowing that anytime you raise taxes and you take that vote, it's difficult. It's easy to give tax breaks. It's the easiest vote any of us can take. It's really hard when you actually have the rationale that you need the funding for a particular purpose. So I'm more about, where is that money going? And right now I can see the need in schools. My kindergartner, his first year in school, he's right now quarantined. We're all okay. We're negative, but 14-day quarantine is starting to feel like a 14-year one. But knowing what schools are going through, teachers and staff, and there is need, and smaller class sizes, and how to keep people safe. We can quantify those needs. Right now in Edina, we have a vote on May 11th for a referendum for a tax levy, because what we're sending Edina is not enough to cover technology, to cover some of the funding for transportation. So if you're seeing one of the most affluent districts saying we need more money, what does that signal to me as their state legislator, that we're not sending them enough money to meet the needs that they want to make sure that we have the right workforce in the future? So that is where I can make that argument and say that may be where to go. What I don't agree with is just having all this money, and to Representative Brindley too, it is totally our job to say where the funding is needed and have those debates. It's not the governor's unilateral discussion. And I agree that we need to be part of that discussion and pass those bills. But sometimes I've been in corporate. I've been now 9 years in the legislature, and I have a small business. There's waste, and there's ways to be more efficient in every single sector. So how do we prioritize? Where do we want those funding to go? The Republicans in the Senate want to spend money on vouchers for private school. I don't agree with that. If we're going to raise your taxes, they should go to the public schools that we are constitutionally you're mandated to fund, and we're not doing that at an adequate level, in my opinion. And we can have that discussion on the floor, Senator Duckworth. But there's many other areas. Health and Human Service will never have enough funding to do exactly what we need in that system, because it's just too much, right? So that's why we rely on the federal transfers as well, federal money coming in that we send to the federal government. We should use that money too for those reasons. But I voted for a tax bill before to raise taxes on gas, and that is not going to be even relevant in the near future because of electric cars. So we need to find ways to have good government, and that requires resources. We talk about our parks, and during this COVID pandemic, a lot of us didn't realize how great of a system we had that we pay for, and now we value it. So we get what we pay for, is my point. And we need to make sure that we're going to raise taxes on the richest Minnesotans, that they see value for those taxes, that we actually prioritize the workforce, we actually prioritize education, infrastructure, that we can attract people to our state to continue to thrive. And now with the law enforcement issue that I keep mentioning, there's a perception that Minnesota's not safe. What do we need to do to have resources, money, to be able to change that perception? That could be in the form of training for police officers, that could be in the form of more accountability measures, that could be in the judicial system. There's so many pieces, and these take resources, and we have to be accountable for those dollars. But I would raise taxes if we have that tie to where those needs are needing to be met. And right now, a lot of people are struggling. So there is an argument to be made that we can use those resources wisely.
All right. Representative New Brindley, Representative Herr, any tax comments that you want to add?
I do just want to add a little bit, Amanda, that I would disagree just a little bit about this isn't the right time to raise taxes. Truthfully, I mean, I do not own a small business, but I come from a long line of small business owners. But my background is in investments and finance, and what I often tell people is that the market is different than the economy, right? We seem to equate the two, and we know that the economy has been struggling, and we are recovering from that, and businesses have been struggling. But the truth is that the market has been at record highs. That those who have are the highest income earners, and those who've had generational wealth have been those who've benefited during the time of this pandemic. It did not impact them in any way. We've seen disproportionate impact on deaths and families and jobs, on small business owners, on communities of color, on people from low income communities. People who've lost jobs have been those who were those who are working, jobs that were paying them, less than minimum wage, or around our middle income earners. And so those are the people who've been hurt the most. Those are the people whose kids have been having issues with learning and the digital divide, who are not able to connect and do well in school. Those are the ones who have not been able to increase their income, and that their income hadn't even recovered from the last recession, right? That wages were not increasing at the same pace, but yet throughout from the last recession to now, those who have had the ability and the privilege of doing well continue to do well. And that I am really proud to be the chief author of the bill that will increase taxes on those who are the wealthiest. And and as Senator Francis said, this is difficult because I represent a district that is educated and affluent. The governor's residence is in my district. And, this is not an easy thing for me to do, but I also understand that Minnesotans, they care about one another. And those of Minnesotans who did really well during this pandemic, I've heard from many of them who said, I am willing to pay more in taxes if that means that somebody's child is going to get the education that they need, that when a small business doesn't have the ability to provide healthcare, that we create a robust option, public option for those who need that so that those employees can stay healthy and come to work and work in those businesses so that the ownership doesn't fall just on the small business owners, that it is our responsibility to ensure that we pay what it is that we can into this if we've done well. And I've heard that from Minnesotans, and I know that there is never a good time to raise taxes, but there is a time in which we know that we need to create a steady stream of revenue so that we can look at the long-term growth of Minnesotans. And so I, just wanted to make sure that we understand that not everybody was impacted the same during this pandemic, and for us to remember that our law should reflect that.
And I'll just chime in here at the end, Amanda. It's the problem with this whole argument is that it's true that some Minnesotans have really suffered during the pandemic and others have done just fine. However, it's very clear that the government has done well. We have a $1.6 billion budget surplus now that does not include the federal money. So we've got almost a $4 billion surplus. That means the government is flush with cash. And we're talking about this one-time money versus ongoing money. Now, this is money that we can't yet appropriate because it's not been forecasted, but we are already seeing revenues coming in hundreds of millions of dollars over forecast. That means those dollars are going to be there 2 years from now when we have to do another budget. And it's perfectly reasonable for us as a government, as legislators, to use some fiscal discipline and say, okay, we are going to budget this right now, and then 2 years from now, we will deal with the budget we have then. But all indications show right now that we will be in a very good position 2 years from now. The economy is growing, tax revenue is coming in above forecast, significantly above forecast. It's just silliness to talk about tax increases. The reality is when we get to the 17th, there are not going to be tax increases included in the final budget.
All right, well, I'm going to ask one more question, but this one's going to have to be a bit of a lightning round. But just from each of your caucus's perspective, what's the number one thing, budget or policy, that you want to get out of this legislative session? And, as succinctly as possible, please. I'll first go with Senator Duckworth.
Crossing my fingers not to have to go first. Just kidding. I'm going to give you two, because one's related to the budget directly, and then one's really just kind of it's that shadow that's looming over the budget conversations I talked about before. Obviously, the number one thing that I think the Senate would like to see is a return. We would like to see our constitutional authority restored. That's kind of number one, because that's literally our job. It's what we were elected to do, to represent our folks, to have a say in our budgetary process and how we're going to utilize funds. So that's a big deal. And the fact that that has to be on the list is a little disheartening, but it is what it is. But in terms of the actual budget, not to beat a dead horse on the conversation that we just had, but the Senate GOP, before we even really began the session, we started saying we're not going to entertain tax increases. And so Representative Herr made a great case, a lot of great things that she said about taxes, et cetera, and a lot of really good and noble causes that she mentioned and how those funds can be utilized. And I think a lot of Minnesotans would say, yeah, if I knew that my increased taxes were directly going to go to those things and the government was going to spend it wisely and there wasn't going to be any waste, it might be a little bit easier to wrap their heads around. But as a business owner myself, I can tell you, if you allow me to keep that additional revenue, it's going to get invested in my people. And I know it's going to get invested in them directly. It's not going to have to go through the bureaucratic process of the government and maybe see a few cents of that taxes get actually where it's supposed to go, versus me making sure as a business owner, dollar for dollar, it goes directly to my people and their families. So again, she's spot on in her reasoning and rationale. I just think the process and how we would like to go about achieving it is a little bit different. So and again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you guys this morning. I greatly appreciate it. Although I didn't see anybody eating any breakfast, but that's okay.
Soon. Representative Herr, how about you?
So I'll just go really quick because there's not enough time to talk all these priorities, but I would just say that still on top of our priority in the caucus in the Minnesota House is police accountability and criminal justice reform. We have some of the greatest disparities in the country when we look at the disproportionate impact on low income community and communities of color when it comes to these particular areas. Building a more equitable Minnesota and addressing our state's disparities, whether it's in education or economics, or wealth or income, that there's a lot that we need to do around that. And then I would say that helping those who have been most impacted by COVID, that's students, workers, small businesses, everyone has been impacted in different ways. And so again, for me, it's about long-term success of people. And I want to just plug in real quick that I'm a refugee to this country, and it was the long-term investment in me that allowed my family to break the cycle of poverty in 1 year. And that if we want to continue to do that, and we want to continue to invest in Minnesotans, all Minnesotans, those who've been in generational poverty, or those who are new to this country, or those who have been here for a long time and are looking at ways to contribute differently to the state of Minnesota, that it is upon us to look at how do we invest in them long term. And so those are our priorities in the Minnesota House Caucus, DFL House Caucus.
Thank you. Representative New Brindley.
Thank you. I will be very brief, and actually you'll be shocked to know that our priorities align very much with the Senate Republicans and Senator Duckworth. We want to see a responsible budget passed with no tax increases. We can fund the state's priorities with no tax increases. And of course, an important piece of that is that the legislature has its constitutional power to both appropriate funds, those federal funds, and write laws again. You know, the governor has bypassed that process for a long time on policy, and it's time for that to end.
Senator Franzen, round us
Well,
out.
I almost was say I agree with all of them, except for I'm not going to draw a line on taxes because I've served on that committee, and certainly there's taxes that are fees, right? I serve on the lead on the Commerce Committee, and there's fees that are proposed from the governor's budget that I agree with, and actually industry does not oppose because they haven't been raised for decades. So that funds the processes and the service that we expect from our Commerce Department. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but overall, I do agree with my colleagues. I think we need to take back our fundamental duty as a legislature, and we have to revisit the emergency powers. That's my personal opinion, because as a lawyer as well, we have separation of judicial branch, legislative branch, and executive. We have to make sure that is still a balance, but outside of whoever it is who's governor ever. But then I think there are more broader language, and I think in the Senate DFL caucus is we want to support working families. And that could be through education, through health and human services, through tax breaks that actually help working families, like tax credits for childcare, tax credits for earned income, working family tax credits. So those are tools that we have in the toolbox. So I think we're going to see some of that with maybe PPP loans as well, because it does help a lot of smaller businesses. I remember when I first applied for it, it was very cumbersome. We actually applied the day that it ran out of money. So I know for a fact that if I'm savvy enough to be part of that, a lot of businesses that probably didn't have the set network that I was able to have were left out. So there are a lot of small businesses who have been left out, and want to make sure that, and those are small mom and pop shops in our main street and working in our community. So we want to make sure we support them. So that is the overarching message, that we want to support working families. And we do want to see some law enforcement reform that is bipartisan. And I think we can get there.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for spending the past hour with us this morning. I thought it was a great conversation. Really appreciate the dialogue. And I mean, especially thank you for your service to the state of Minnesota. Being a legislator is always a hard job, but I think during this virtual session and a pandemic and everything that's going on, I mean, you all have had very tough jobs, and the chamber thanks you, and the citizens of the state thank you for all your hard work. And good luck in the final 2 weeks here. I hope you all find success, whatever the definition is for you. And again, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If we go into
And just a
overtime.
quick thank you also to our sponsors again today, Charter Communications, Flint Hills, and Velocity Public Affairs. And everybody have a great day. Bye.